We're in the end of chapter 19, the very end. So on page 50 in Likutei Amarim. So again, what are we discussing? We're discussing per se, the short path. And what he's saying is that other than building a balanced proportion of one's sense of self and the Kodesh Baruch Hu's presence, other than that, there's an intuitive, a natural, inherent faith and love for Hashem that is essential and intrinsic in every Jew's consciousness, even though it could very well be concealed. That was the paradox we described throughout the last chapter, that the intrinsicness of a Jew's faith in Hashem, of a Jew's inherent faith and love, ahava mesuteret, of a Kodesh Baruch Hu, the intrinsicness of it is in itself the reason for its concealment, that it's being very deep. It's like most things in life, that as long as my life is evolving around a relatively superficial routine, so the more profound intrinsic layers of who I am, as fundamental as they are to me, but they could ironically become irrelevant to my routine because of the superficial routine that I'm overly involved in. So as long as that's the case, I mean, in simple terms, the way he says it here, that there could be a Jew that his Yiddishkeit, he's so involved in other things in life, his ego, his own self, or his personal interests, he's so enveloped in them that even though he is as much a believer as any other Jew, and it's as valuable to him, and that will become apparent if his life were to pivot up against these profound layers, then that would all become apparent immediately. But because his routine of life does not evolve around these layers, and he runs a very superficial routine, so therefore the superficial mentality that he's seeping in is the only part that's apparently relevant. So that's called this is why these layers are called mesuteret, ahava or emunah mesuteret. The word mesuteret means that it's concealed or intrinsically concealed. Okay, it doesn't have to be concealed. It's just profound, and because of its depth, then a superficial life is prone to conceal your depths. This dynamic is true about the animal soul in of itself as well. Like the example, I think we even mentioned this example, that the world tends to discuss that a person only becomes aware of the value of his health or of his freedom when these things are threatened. Even in the animal soul itself, the more profound layers of life are very often the less relevant ones, because a mundane, superficial routine renders them irrelevant and conceals over them. So all the more so in a Jew's godly soul, that the Jew's faith, the Jew's emunah and love for Hashem is concealed in intrinsic faith, as long as his life is not evolving around these areas of life. So as intrinsic as it is, unless something comes about and pivots him up against these layers directly, they're as intrinsic as they are, they're practically irrelevant to his routine. So that's what we said up until now. So now we're at the end of chapter Yutet. Now these layers, what's the vort that we're going up about in the next 5-6 chapters? The vort is that a person needs to learn how to harness these layers, and not say it differently, that you need to adopt a profound enough view on reality in order to develop for your routine behavior to relate to something profound within yourself. I mean, the more you conceive of reality as something superficial, and you don't tend to live, it takes things seriously. So you don't find yourself relating to life from a serious, profound place. So the whole vort that he's going to develop now is how a person needs to reassess his conception of reality in a way that it will naturally relate and correspond to the depth of his soul. So we said a few layers here in this understanding of how to read the chapters. That after he discusses the depth of your faith, of your inherent faith, and he mentions that this depth is a paradoxical state because it's so deep that it could be irrelevant. But that irrelevancy is a result of a superficial life. So then he says that if you reassess how you view life, you see the routine, mundane details of life as something more profound, you have a more profound view on reality, then inevitably you'll find yourself relating to reality from a more profound place, and then your inherent faith will become very relevant. And what's the simple examples here? That if the circumstances of life were to present you with something clearly important, like if someone came up to you, like the example we always say, and says, "I'll kill you if you don't bow down to this statue." Like if the relevancy would jump up and bite you, then you would react from these profound places. If reality shied at you that something profound is happening right now, and what's going on right now is a radical occurrence, then you'd instinctively react from a profound radical place. So that these places, these layers within yourself don't surface easily into your mundane reactions are because you don't conceive of the circumstances being something important. So you need to deepen your understanding. Or two things: either you wait around for some guy to come with an axe, and maybe that'll happen. Okay, that'll awaken your Mesiras Nefesh Shalom. Or you need to learn how to see circumstances deeper, in order for it to instinctively relate to these deeper layers within your soul. That's what he wants to discuss. So I jumped a little bit forward. That's what we're going to discuss. That's where he's going with all of this in the next chapter. But we have a few lines at the end of chapter 19 we haven't read yet. So we'll read the last paragraph here, the last portion on page 50, and then we'll start Perek Chaf. And what he's going to say now is after he discussed again the profound nature and inevitably the concealed nature of these inherent traits. So now he's just noting another point, that a lot of we could call maybe the calculations or the considerations that are typical for my superficial life are irrelevant in a deeper place. Like you say that you can agel pinot, you can circle the square. Okay, in superficial life, like where things don't really matter so much. And then another phenomena usually is that you can compromise a lot. You can round the square a lot. It doesn't have to be sharp. So he says that he's just noting that this trait, where things are called a ruach shtut. The phrase in Chassidut is ruach shtut, a spirit of folly, which literally means, shtut comes from the word stia, which means to waver, a wavering spirit, which means that instead of going straight, sharp, then you tend to go, walk a little bit to the right, a little bit left, lo nara. That tendency that you can cognitively, like if something were very, very important, somewhere you're doing medical tests now, and the results have direct implications for life or death, then you'd be very sharp and focused. You wouldn't be willing at all to compromise the precision of your calculations. But the more you feel, the more you conceive that the circumstances at hand that you're dealing with are not so important, the less focus, less concentration you have in your mind, and the more you tend to compromise. So you could find yourself miscalculating. I forgot a shekel here, I forgot a shekel there, I didn't. But if the more something seems serious, like this is another result, another symptom of superficial conception of reality. It coasts, it permutes a spirit of folly, a ruach shtut, a wavering spirit, the tendency to not be sharp, not understand things clearly. So the more deep and profound your conception of reality, and inevitably the more of the depth of who you are relates to reality, the less compromising you are. Like the Rabbi, this word is very, very. This entire section of Tanya is like very, very typical of the Rabbi, of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There's a word that says that the Rebbe, the Rebbe's whole nesius, a funny word, it's a joke, half a joke, but it's very true. That the Rebbe's whole nesius was about a square, a triangle, and a circle. That he had Mesiras Nefesh that matzahs should only be round, and that menorahs should only be triangular, and that the Luchot HaBrit should only be square. That was his mishagas. So the Rebbe had he had mishagas about these things. And what did he always say, especially about the very famous machlokes, a very famous issue that the Rebbe put himself on disproportionately? The whole world, the whole Jewish Haredi world is familiar with this because the Rebbe was so. If you walk into a silverware store and you want a triangular menorah for Hanukkah, it's called a Lubavitcher menorah. That's what they call it. You want a Lubavitcher menorah. It's not called the Rambam's menorah. It's not called Rashi's menorah, even though they both say it's triangular. It's called a Lubavitcher menorah. Why? Because the Rebbe, he had mishagas about this. He gave over discourses and what did he say the whole time? That it's very symbolic to him. That the Jews, so what if the tablets on my book have round tops? So what if this form of the tablets is originally coming from a Christian misinterpretation? Well, on the Raz, 800 years down the line, who cares? We're familiar with it. It's more appealing, maybe. I don't know. It's more aesthetic to me. So the Rebbe was fiercely negating. It bothered him that you can so easily round the corners. If this were if the doctor told you to take a square pill, you wouldn't take the round pill, right? Because it matters to you. And this is going to save your life, and it's not going to save your life. So Yiddishkeit should matter to you. So again, a lot of the Rebbe's mentality was all about straight angles, being gleich, being straight, smooth. So this is the Moichin here in Tanya, same thing. That the more a person, you could say the simplest trait about the Rebbe is that he was a very serious guy. He took things very, very seriously. He took everything very, very seriously. He didn't have a drop of cynicism to him. There was no cynicism to the Rebbe. Everything was tmimut, ernstkeit. Like we just finished Hod Shabbat from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Sfiras Omer. So today is already Netzach Sheba Yesod. Tomorrow is Hod Sheba Yesod. So Hod, we always say that it's tmimut. And tmimut means ernstkeit. Ernstkeit is seriousness, taking something seriously. So this whole word here is being an earnest Jew. That's the whole word. Like taking life seriously, taking Kodesh Baruch Hu seriously, taking mitzvahs seriously. The whole word of Ruach Shtut and your imminent ability to serve a Kodesh Baruch Hu, to not only balance out your life, but right now, within your unbalanced state, be able to recruit profound koiches, powers from your soul in order to cope with the present. It's all dependent on how seriously you take it. The more serious you are about it, the more you'll find yourself sharp and straight. So that's again what he's saying here. This is another symptom of the superficial nature of one's life, which again surfaces the superficial layers of his self. That you find yourself circling the angles, compromising. So, when a deeper layer of yourself awakens, then you can't do that. Like if you tell a Jew, like, okay, Don't bow down to the statue. There are many stories, like the most famous stories, like Hannah and her 7 sons. And after the Roman emperor, he tries to get the children to bow down to the statue, and they almost are their nefesh. They're all willing to die on Kiddush Hashem. Then he gets down to the last one, the 3-year-old baby, and all of his minions, all of his people are watching, and he's embarrassed. He's embarrassed that these Jews, these 7 children, and their mother, they're going to beat him in this psychological warfare. So it says in the historical writings that he tried to do a trick. That he took off his ring and he threw it down next to the statue, and he asked the baby to pick up the ring. Now, even halachically, okay, you could do that. Like he wanted to just to get the impression that one of the baby bowed down to the statue, and he wouldn't. That baby wouldn't do it. So again, the more you're pivoted up against a deeper place in your life, the less your cognition compromises. So you can't tell yourself anymore, it doesn't matter. Lo nora, it's nothing. A shekel to here, a shekel to there. That entire tendency to compromise edges is typical of superficial awareness. So simultaneously with awakening a more profound layer of yourself, you're also ironing out all of your waveringness. Your entire cognition gets ironed out. You can no longer tell yourself it's no big deal. So your Mesiras Nefesh, the deeper, profound layers, see no different. You don't slip through the little breaches. So that's what he's saying here as well. That's the additional note he's noting. So we'll read it inside. This light, this awareness of Hashem, which is pivoted and embodied within every Jew's faith, which can be again routinely concealed, like he said in the last page. So but when it appears, gadol ve'atzum kocho kol kach, it's so strong, it's so intense. לגרש ולדחות הסטרה האחה והקליפות שלא יוכלו ייגעו אפילו בלבושיו של מחשבה דיבור ומעשה של אמונת השם אחד. So when this appears, just like we said, the main word that when this appears, then you're willing to moisten your nefesh. But this willingness, this appearance of a profound layer within yourself, not only does it bring forth your willingness to moisten your nefesh, but it's relevant, it appears within all the details of your behavior. All your machshava dibur ma'aseh, even the slightest wavering, it's not going to compromise anything. The dire, the more intrinsic and deep the layer of your soul revealed, the less compromise is it willing to capacitate. So it won't be even yigu. Again, it deters klipa from even touching like the edge of your levushim, even the garments of your soul, which are thought, speech, and action. For instance, לעמוד בניסיון למסור נפשו אפילו שלא לעשות רק איזה מעשה לבד נגד אמונת השם אחד. כגון להשתחוות לעבודה זרה, אף שאינו מאמין בכלל בליבו. So he says the exact example we mentioned before. That, for instance, just bowing down, like doing what's the dynamic here? He says that a superficial state of mind compromises the relevance of your intrinsic state of mind. But the revelation of your intrinsic state of mind does not compromise the relevance of your superficial state of mind. Like when you feel something is extremely important, you could think that if something's not so important, then you forget what matters to you. You don't relate to it very deeply. And you could think that on the other side, if something's very important, so the details wouldn't matter so much. Like, for instance, what he's saying here. That what matters to me is just that I don't believe in Hashem. And what I'm going to say right now, so this is a very familiar statement. And you could hear this from people very often. The Jew would tell you, I don't do keep Shabbos, I don't do kashrus, but I believe in Hashem. So it's seemingly contradicting what he's saying here. But if you contemplate on it, you'll see that that's exactly what he's saying here. That as long as a Jew is living in a superficial state, so he compromises his depth. But once his depth is revealed, if that were to happen, this same Jew that tells you, and then, this has happened throughout history millions of times, and the same Jew that tells you that he's a believer, he's a Jew in heart. So seemingly he's not compromising the depth. But again, all the details don't matter to him. If he were put up against Mesiras Nefesh, if someone were to, then he'd moister his nefesh not only for the big things, he'd moister his nefesh all over the details. If a guy would come around to him and tell him that he just wants him to do the smallest thing against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but to do it as a reflection of not being connected to Hashem, then he'd moister his nefesh for the smallest detail. This is the two-sided equation that he wants to present. And again, that very same Jew that within his superficial state of mind compromises his depth, and therefore it would bring him to this sense that my faith is intact and the details I don't do. When his faith is revealed, so it reveals itself within those details that he seems to not count, to not be impressed by. So he'd be willing to moister his nefesh on the smallest thing if he felt it were relevant to his faith. Not only on his faith, not only is a Jew willing to moister his nefesh to not, to not become to lehamir dato, to not convert. No. Once it's like the story we said about the child, the son of Hannah, that even to pick up a ring off the floor, if it's associated to him with the implication of idolatry, so even to do something superficial he wouldn't be willing to do, even though he'd be maintaining his faith. Simultaneously, he knows to himself, I don't believe it, I'm not meaning to worship it, so much so that even halachically, if it weren't in public, it would be mutar. Not only mutar, in certain conditions, it could even be forbidden not to. It could even be forbidden not to do it. And they're simply in the simplest version, simplest understanding of halacha. And then in situations where a Jew isn't chayav, he doesn't have to moiser his nefesh, then it's very likely to say that he's forbidden to moiser his nefesh. It's like suicide. You're not allowed to just jump into the fire for no reason. There are 3 mitzvahs that halachically you have to yihareg ve'ad yavo, you have to die and not commit. But all the other 610 mitzvahs, then simply you're forbidden to die in order to commit. You have to, like Shabbos, for instance. So no, you're not allowed to. You're allowed to decide that you're going to keep Shabbos and not do pikuach nefesh because you have mesiras nefesh. It's forbidden. Now, because that's the case, then again, there's a lot of area for folly. You have to waver and to play with these considerations. The more something touches a profound layer in your soul, the more prone you are to feel that these considerations are irrelevant. Like that child. So he could have considered that maybe just picking up a ring is halachically permitted. And if it's halachically permitted, maybe it's even halachically compelling. I have to do it. But intuitively, he didn't even think about it. Because once something associates to an intrinsic layer, then it renders all the superficial imperfections irrelevant. Just irons you right out. And you intuitively, your instinct drives you from your faith, from your deep faith. So that's what he's saying here, that not to think that the relevance of a Jew's mesiras nefesh remains relevant only to very big things, big nisyonos. Once this layer of your soul becomes apparent, becomes in the front of your personality, then it becomes relevant to any detail, the slightest thing, the slightest superficial action you'd be asked to do, if it even resembles or associates lightly with something profound, you wouldn't do it. So not to think that Mesiras Nefesh, when it appears, is relevant for big things only. Not at all. That sort of trait, where you feel a difference between big things and small things, that itself is a spirit of folly. That itself is a typical state of mind of a superficial mentality. The more superficial your mentality, the more you tend to make like grades of what's more and less important. The more intrinsic your awareness is at that point of time, the less grades seem relevant. The smallest detail seems as important. Again, like we said in the beginning of today's class, you can see these phenomena also in just simple animal soul psychology. That if something is now very eminently important for your health, then you go down to details as if they're the most important parts of the decision. And you have an inability to ignore detail. And the logic that in mundane life tells you that this is more important, that's not so bad, it doesn't seem logical anymore. It gets pushed aside. So kal v'chomer, all the more so in your godly soul. That once Mesiras Nefesh is relevant and apparent, it becomes relevant in all details of life. That's what he's saying here. So, for instance, to bow down to Avodah Zarah, even if you don't mean it, and it has no faith and no love in it, just as a superficial action, even that you wouldn't be willing to do. So even just if someone tells you to say something, just say something that there's no HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Just say it. Just pronounce the words. Cut your lips. You can't do it. If it associates with something deep, you can't word out the words. It's too traumatic to word out those words. So the simplest, most superficial behavior you wouldn't be able to do if it associated with something profound in your soul. Like in Chazal, you see this a lot. That if our sages write something in the Midrash or in the Talmud that's against the Kadosh Baruch Hu Kivechol, like for instance. There's even in a halachic debate, it says you're not allowed to mekalel Hashem, you're not allowed to blasphemy. Okay, so when in the debate in the Talmud about blasphemy, not once is there a blasphemic statement. They always use strange allegories, like Yossi hit Yossi. That's a famous quotation. Like, because you can't voice it, you can't say it, even as an example, even as a technical, superficial example. You can't say. So again, when a profound layer is revealed, exposed, then it penetrates all the way down, irons out all the fluctuations of the spirit of folly. Not even to speak wrongly of God's unity. Even if your mouth and heart aren't one with that, just to say it with your lips, you wouldn't be willing to. Like even though your heart remains completely whole in the faith of Hashem, still you wouldn't be willing to voice it out. So again, the term, the phrase he used before to describe your intrinsic concealed layers was ahava mesuter. Concealed love or intrinsic love. So he said that this deterrence, this intuitive deterrence, like that example we just said now, that you find yourself incapable to word out something against your faith. You're intuitively deterred from doing that. That's called yir'ah klula be'ava. That's fear, the inter-inclusion of, it's called gvura sheba chesed, the inter-inclusion of fear within love. That because something is so, your connection to Hashem is so inherent and intrinsic, then anything that remotely associates with severing that, you're intuitively fearful of. So there's awe, fear, yirah, inter-includes within your love. As a result, like a symptom of your love. So that's, again, fear that's a symptomatic reaction of your love for something is called yirah shebe'ahava, the inter-inclusion of fear within love. So therefore, because you have this intrinsic love, you have an intrinsic fear as well, which is like an intuitive deterrence from anything that undermines your love, that threatens your love, your bond. שהיא אהבה טבעית בנפש האלוקית שבחירות ישראל, שחפצה ורצונה בטבעה להידבק בשורשה ומקורה אור אינסוף ברוך הוא. So as we discussed before, that your love is so involved in clinging and connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, your source of life, שמפני האהבה זו ורצון זה, היא רעה מפחדת בטבעה מלגוע בקצה טומאת עבודה זרה חס ושלום. Because of this, as a result of this intrinsic love and will for Hashem, then your soul is intrinsically awe and fearful in its nature from even touching the edge, the hem of Avodah Zarah. That's the word. That's the literal translation. She negative emunat Hashem, because anything that's opposing or the opposite of that faith which you're clinging to. Afilu b'levushei achitzonim, not even in your soul's most external garments like speech or action, without any without any faith, still just wording it out, you wouldn't be willing to, because you have like a nonsensible fear. It's like something like I said, even halachically, it's not so clear. If you're learning halacha, so it's pretty obvious you're allowed to say anything in order to figure out the halacha and make it clear. Moreover, it even says explicitly in halacha, a very famous discourse by the Rabbi about this as well, that where something is relevant for halacha, you have to be very precise. It says about the animals in Noah's Ark. When Noah was bringing the animals into the Ark, then the phrase in the Torah for the impure animals, it doesn't say tmeot. The Torah doesn't say that he brought tameh animals. It says he brought pure animals and impure animals. In Hebrew, there's no word for impure, so it's 4 different words, 4 additional words in order to not say tameh. It says hachaya asher einena tehora. 4 words. The animal which is not pure, instead of saying tameh. So Chazal say from this famous word in the beginning of Masechet Pesachim that a person should always use a clean language. You shouldn't say tameh. You should say unpure. And the Rabbi has a very long discourse. Also, the Gemara there asks, the Torah says tameh hundreds of times. The word tameh appears in the Torah hundreds of times. So if you shouldn't use the word tameh, then it should always say those animals who are not pure. Why does it always say tameh? The word the Rebbe says is that where it's relevant to halacha, in the times in the Torah, the Torah is giving you a practical guidance, a halachic guidance, and the Torah has to speak in clear-cut terminology. So it doesn't go walkabouts, those who are not pure. It says tameh. But here they're just telling a story, and there's no practical implications. So there, in those cases, you should use a cleaner tongue. Okay, but you see that halachically, that's not the case about faith. Any time in halacha, that even though it's a halachic debate with practical implications, still our sages choose wording that is less clear in order to not say blasphemous things. Even though, again, halachically it shouldn't be that way. You should, where there's a halachic implication, seemingly in the conclusion of this Talmudic discourse in Pesachim, you should be using clear-cut phrases, terminology, in order for the halacha to be clear. But again, you see, in reality, that's not the case. That blasphemy, like even mundane examples, technical details, like giving an example of what does it mean to be blasphemous. If a Jew says this about the Kodesh Baruch Hu, says that about the Kodesh Baruch Hu, so there's never an example that's actually blasphemy. You can't even say it. So why is that the case? There's a voice that's coming to me now that there's a difference between, like, in this discourse from the Rebbe. So he says that, like, the Torah chooses better words. When our sages don't, again, when it's not a halachic discourse, so it chooses cleaner words. Here, where our sages don't use these examples, it wasn't a cognitive choice. It's just a lack of capability. You're not capable of saying it. So they had to use different words, even though it's not as clear. There's a famous story about the Alter Rebbe, very similar to what we're discussing here. When he was in Petersburg, when he was in prison, so he didn't have kosher food. So for a very long time, he was starving, and so much so, a very famous story. Everybody's familiar with it. I mean, his wardens were very worried that he was gonna chas v'shalom perish because he wasn't eating. And at some point, a very high minister came and visited him. Famous story how they met. And one of the things he came to visit for was he wanted to, how can we get you food? And after the Alter Rebbe was impressed by this guy, so he instructed him to go to a certain Jew in the city in Petersburg that he knew and trusted. And he told him if he'd bring him a sealed container and everything with the food in such a manner, and this type of food, then he'd trust him, he'd be willing to eat it. And this is also how later on the Alter Rebbe got notes out. He put a note back in the almost empty food, and that's how he sent out messages that he's still alive to the Hasidim. But it's also a very famous discourse from the Rebbe that he asks that, halachically, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to decide that you'll die of starvation in order to not eat something that's not the Mahadran kosher, or you're not allowed to perish of starvation in order to eat not something that's treif. So how could the Alter Rebbe permit himself to not eat? And so much so that he was willing to, for Mesiras Nefesh. So again, this is not one of the three mitzvot that the Torah commands us to moiser our nefesh. So it's not permitted to do that. You have to. So the Rebbe said is very similar to what we're saying here now. That it's not that the Alter Rebbe had a halachic consideration which he determined that he's allowed to moiser his nefesh. No, it could very well be that if you would have asked him, he would have said, "Nachon, it's be'emet, it's not permitted." It wasn't. It was just he couldn't do it. He couldn't eat it. It wasn't a question of permission or not permission. It was a question of capability. And the Alter Rebbe himself had a very famous saying that a Jew, I don't remember the literal translation in Yiddish, but the Jew doesn't want and is not capable to disconnect himself from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're two different things. It's also you don't want to, and also there's a lack of capabilities. That's like the phrases he's mentioning here in the end of the chapter. That your love and your will to be connected to Hashem, it projects an intuitive deterrence that you lack capability. Like when this is apparent to you, when this is exposed, that you lack capability to sever your connection to Hashem, and even to do something that would, in the most lightly relevant way, imply severing that connection. Like again, like even just wording out words. Like saying a blasphemous statement, even though you don't mean it at all, just using an example. It's saying that you don't believe in Hashem or something. You couldn't even word it out. It'd be hard. You'd feel you're not capable of saying it. This is an instinctive, an intuitive deterrence resulting from your love to Hashem. So this is like the Alter Rebbe is saying that a Jew doesn't want and can't. He's also incapable. And there's a lack of capability resulting of that will. So your will is like your love to connect, your will to connect, your yearning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But that very yearning results in a deterrence, a lack of capability to disconnect. So that's the end of chapter 19. So he just noted on top of, again, the general vort, which the whole train of thought here is leading on. The first two chapters we started in this portion of Tanya, so that's chapter 18 and 19. What did we conclude? That after we discussed the balance which a person needs to his whole life refine, maintain, and cultivate a balance within himself in order to be able to serve Hashem fully. In addition to that, there are intrinsic inherent traits that one needs to tap into and recruit constantly in his present moment, even if it's unbalanced in general, in order to stand to any nisayon. And that our ability to do that is an inheritance from our forefathers, and every Jew has it within himself intrinsically. Now, what he added on in the end here is just to note 2 points: that this deep, profound layer, when apparent, doesn't remain relevant only in very important deep things. It becomes imminently relevant to every detail of life. It penetrates all the details of life. And it has two sides to it. Just like what he began explaining in the beginning of the chapter, that fundamentally what you have is a love and faith, like a will for Hashem, a yearning, like the candle that was his example in the beginning. But the relevance, the practical relevance of that in life is that your love projects an intuitive deterrence from anything threatening that love. Like the very famous statement that even in a way, this deterrence, like this lack of capability to even word out a heretical statement, that fear, that intrinsic inability to say something against my faith, is more typical to a Jew even than his love. So even if very often our burning, fiery, intrinsic love for Hashem isn't so aware, but the intuitive deterrence projecting from it is much more present in my life. Like Chazal say, the very famous statement we like quoting, that who's a Jew? Mihu Yehudi. About Mordechai Yehudi, they asked us. And that word Yehudi, what does it mean to be a Yehudi? Mihu Yehudi. So the answer in the Gemara in Masechet Megillah is Kol mi shekofer ba'avodah zarah. That even though we say this very often, this word, that even though the word Jew, Yehudi, in Torah means to admit, the literal meaning of a Jew is hodaya, hodot, to admit. So simple literal meaning of being a Jew is that you have admittance to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you'd think that the Torah would say that who's a Jew? Someone who admits to the truth. But no, the Torah says that who's a Jew? Someone who's koifer, he's heretic about anything that's not HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A Jew's heresy to darkness is stronger than his admittance to light. That's the word. It's more relevant and apparent in my life, my intuitive deterrence from anything detaching me from Hashem, even than my love for Hashem. So this is very well phrased in this ma'amar from our sages. That who's a Jew, again, if you read it in Hebrew, it's a phenomenal statement. It immediately rings your bells. Because who's a Jew? Again, the literal meaning for Jew is someone who admits, and the statement is who's a Jew? Someone who's heretic to what's not the truth. And so being a Jew is more apparently negating or being deterred from anything against your faith, even than believing, even than actively believing. The same thing he says here, that as a result of, why is that the case? Again, because your intrinsic life and faith could be very profound and not so relevant and aware superficially. So the symptoms projecting from it, of deterrence, of inability to go against it, are more apparent in your life even than your faith itself. Like like a person has a disease, but the disease itself isn't apparent, but the symptoms are all over the place. Same thing here. A Jew's inherent faith, it projects symptoms of intuitive inability and deterrence from anything threatening that faith, even when the faith itself isn't conscious, isn't aware, isn't strongly apparent in your routine of life. And in addition, therefore it's also relevant in every detail. It's not just something that is relevant in big, like my faith is something big, so it becomes relevant in big scenarios. No, it's relevant to any detail because it's also, again, it doesn't exist in a realm where cognitive compromise is relevant. The deeper and more profound my layer of myself is apparent, the less compromising I am. So the less does it seem logical to me to say that this is Lona, that's Lona. That itself is typical for a superficial state of mind. So these are the two things that he added on here. And these are very relevant. Why? Because in the next chapter, what he wants to build up is how a person, like we started saying today, how a person in his reassessment of reality, of how he assesses, understands the scenarios of what's going on in his life, in a deeper way, he inevitably finds himself associating to life from a deeper, stronger place. And that's the avoida he wants to discuss in all these chapters. So again, the next two chapters are very deep Kabbalistic terms. It's like a synopsis of Sharichut Ve'emunah. The second portion of Tanya, which is a very, very deep scholastic study. It's a scholar. It's very, it's not avoided at all. It's not psychology. It's like understanding the mechanisms, very, very thin Kabbalistic understanding of reality, of the objective reality, how to understand the unity of Hashem within our world. So it's not typically a psychological understanding. So the next two chapters revolve around a synopsis of what he writes, and he mentions that very often here, that as we've explained more and more elaborated upon in the other portion of Tanya. So we're going to have to go through this, even though it's somewhat of a difficult study. But these two chapters, why is it relevant to you in the train of thought here?
Yeah.
Because that's the vort he's saying. That the more you have a profound understanding of reality, the more you'll find yourself relating to life from a deeper place within yourself. And then inevitably, all of these intuitive faculties, inherent faculties we have, will become very relevant in our lives. So in order to do that, you have to reassess how you see reality. So there's like a 2-chapter synopsis of reassessment of reality, which is actually explained in Chassidus in very, very long, elaborate maimarim, but here it's a short synopsis in order to awaken a deeper relationship with reality.